Thank you for joining. Looks like folks are starting to filter in. Welcome to the November Non-Point Source Technical Exchange webcast, where we're going to be focusing on advancing watershed protection through land conservation. As you're joining, please do make sure that you're muted, just so we don't have any issues with background noise as our presenters are giving their talks. I'm going to let folks keep filtering in for a minute or so. So it looks like we still have lots of folks joining, but I'll get us kicked off officially in about a minute. I think someone did mute themselves, so thank you for that.
And yeah, how are we?
All right. Well, it looks like we still have some folks joining, but we do have a packed agenda today. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome everyone to the November Non-Point Source Technical Exchange webcast series. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. For those who have been following the webcast series for a while, you know that we feature a variety of topics all related to non-point source management. The topic this month is advancing watershed protection through land conservation. And first of all, I want to give a huge thanks.
Your son is in the loony bin because he killed.
I want to give a huge thanks to Steve Epting for putting this webcast together. And I'll say another reminder right now, please just make sure you're muted as you're joining. We have a really excellent set of presenters today. The way that we'll structure this webcast is Steve's going to give a few brief remarks on the topic, and then we're going to go right into our presentations. We're going to be starting with Abigail Weinberg, who's the Director of Conservation Research at the Open Space Institute. Our next presenter is going to be Alec, who's the NRCS Agricultural Conservation Easement Program Agricultural Land Easements Outreach Coordinator, which is a mouthful. We're really excited to have you here. We're then going to move and hear from Grady Spann, who's the Executive Director of the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust. And then we're going to wrap up with Becky.
Recording in progress.
Oh, please make sure you're muted. Thank you. Our final presenter is going to be Becky Roark, who's the Executive Director of the Beaver Watershed Alliance. So we're going to have our presenters present one after the other, and then we're going to do a group question and answer session at the end of the webcast. So please, if you have questions for our presenters, you can feel free to put them in the chat so they're recorded and we'll get to them at the end. Or you can also just feel free to kind of jot them down or keep them in the back of your mind, because during our Q&A session, we'll give the option to raise your hand and ask your question out loud as well if you'd prefer. This webcast is being recorded. And so if you have colleagues that weren't able to make it today, or you have to jump off a little bit early, no worries. The recording will be posted on our Non-Point Source website, and I'll put the link to that in the chat so you have access to it. Without further ado, I'll hand it off to Steve Epting to introduce the topic.
Great, thanks, Ellie. And I'll just do a quick check. Can you see and hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Steve Epting. I work with Ellie in the Non-Point Source program at EPA headquarters. I am personally thrilled for this lineup today and just want to, again, give a big shout out to our fantastic lineup of speakers. One of the hats that I wear in the headquarters Non-Point Source program is the lead for our Healthy Watersheds work. As many of you know, protecting unimpaired or healthy waters is a key focus in the National Non-Point Source program. So really excited to feature land conservation, which is a key protection strategy. I'm just going to give a little bit of context and then we'll dive right in. So as all of us know in the Non-Point Source community, as a watershed-based community where many of our efforts are really aimed at planning and implementing water quality practices at a watershed scale. Part of that work really entails finding the right mix of management strategies for a given watershed to achieve water quality goals. And one of those management strategies that we've been kind of putting a renewed focus on in the Non-Point Source program in the last few years is land conservation. particularly in cases where there may be less developed watersheds with more opportunities to conserve lands. Land conservation can really be a key part of a non-point source and more generally water quality efforts. I think you'll get a good sense today that there can be a lot of different specific definitions for land conservation. You'll hear examples where land conservation means conserving the development rights of certain land parcels. Other cases where land conservation refers to the outright acquisition or the purchase of an entire land parcel. For our purposes in the non-point source program, I think generally we can think about land conservation as efforts to conserve one or more conservation values of land. And again, conserving lands either by purchasing partial rights to those lands or conserving the lands outright. And in general, I think what Abigail will touch on at the top here is there's a really strong link from the science between land conservation as a management strategy and water quality outcomes, where conserving lands can be a really effective strategy, including in some cases alongside other restoration strategies to meet water quality goals. And one of the things that we know from recent work in the land conservation space, including through our Healthy Watersheds Consortium grant program that's wrapping up, that was an initiative led with the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, is that the land conservation community is generally really tied in and cued into water quality. So there are more than 1,000 land conservation organizations across the country. Many of them frequently talk about water quality as a driver of their land conservation work. Some of our other key federal programs, Natural Resources Conservation Service at USDA, FEMA, and others are really also teed into thinking about the role of land conservation in meeting their program goals. So I'll leave it there for now, but just want to again thank our speakers, and at that I'll turn it over to Abigail to get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Steve and Ellie. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and with so many folks who are all thinking and strategizing about land conservation. So this is always the awkward part where you get your presentation on full screen. I'm going to talk to you today about some work Open Space Institute is doing to address this big question that we've been thinking about for a couple of years. How do we advance watershed protection through land conservation? And I want to start with a little introduction to who Open Space Institute is. I realize folks may not know us. We are actually a land trust, one of the bigger ones in the country, working across the eastern United States. We do direct acquisition of large parcels, so we tend to do only larger projects in select geographies. But then what's unique about us is we also have this program that sits somewhat aside from our direct acquisition, where we're supporting the conservation field in advancing conservation through grants and loans. We aggregate funding from foundations and distribute that money with a real science intention. And our focus is on climate change and also on water quality. And you'll see this cluster of projects. These are all of our grant projects and the different grant funds in different colors across the different years. And you'll see that the Delaware River Basin has been a focus of Open Space Institute for since about 2013. And we've been looking at how do we measure and evaluate the impact of that work that we've done to date. So I'm going to cover a little bit about the Delaware River Watershed Initiative, since it's a bit of a unique experiment with a really significant investment in achieving water quality in a larger basin in the U.S. And so let you know a little bit about what that is, about how we targeted land protection in our fund as part of that initiative, and then how we've, over the last 3 or 4 years, been looking at evaluating that impact and share the conclusions. But the conclusions are really thoughts that are still in process. And what I'm hoping is very much through the conversation here with all of you that we can advance some of this because we really, can't do it alone. It's really the advancement of the field and best practices that really needs to kind of come together in order to achieve real progress in this area. So Delaware River Basin, I think a lot of folks know a bit about it, but want to emphasize it's the drinking water source for 15 million people, not just in the Delaware Basin, where you actually have fewer people than that overall, but also for New York City, because water siphoned from the upper basin to New York City. It is 15 million people is 5% of the US population, but this is only 0.4% of the US land base. So this place is playing a disproportionate role in supplying clean water to our populations. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that the land use across the basin from north to south really differs. So while the northern part of the basin looks like the first picture, as you move down the basin, you really get these different land uses and different challenges. So we recognized from the beginning that a mix of land protection and restoration was needed. Population growth is strong here. It's definitely part of the Northeast corridor. So thinking about all that, where do we protect land? Do we protect it where there's the greatest threat to conversion, the least threat to conversion? How do we figure this out? So one of the starting pieces of the puzzle was identifying some target areas across the basin where we had a mix of high forest cover areas and threat to development that would serve as kind of the test cases for achieving our land protection goals. So we identified these 5 places with the William Penn Foundation, who's been the main driver of this initiative, and selected these, and then reached out to land conservation groups in those areas. So these were selected again, high forest cover and existing ability to produce clean water, but also a growing population and a risk to losing some of that ability to produce clean water. We also looked for land conservation capacity, and we needed to work in places where there were groups that could really achieve the work on the ground. And just to share for those of you interested in theories of change and open source conservation planning, this is the model, the end part of the model that we developed to guide the work of this initiative. We, it really included ecological outcomes as well as water quality and quantity outcomes, as well as community outcomes. So with everything that tries to do so much, it can get busy and complex, but we were very clear that we were not looking for just a water quality standard, but really an ecological standard and maintaining the healthy watersheds, both for human and ecological communities. So that's important as you think about evaluating your impact. It's a much broader goal to evaluate. So as I mentioned, this is a partnership, and there were 50 organizations on the ground really leading the work that would get done. So we, the approach that the initiative took was to really put the work of prioritization in the hands of the groups doing the work. And we asked them to work collaboratively across those 5 geographies to identify priorities. And that's never an easy task. These are the 5 different approaches that came out of that first phase of planning back in 2013. Everybody had different data sets they were using. They had different approaches. Some of them, as you see here, were parcel based. Other ones, were sort of raster based, and were looking at, a lot of different data sets and putting them together in an index. Some of them were more conceptual. And so it made it very hard for us to evaluate projects across these geographies on a kind of apples to apples basis. And as a result, we decided we should provide a resource across the basin for a data set that could be used by the groups for planning at their discretion to some extent, and but with a lot of encouragement. And we created an index actually driven off of the U.S. Forest Service forest to faucet analysis. So this is a HUC 12 analysis, and we called it the ability to produce clean, abundant water, right? So it was water quality and quantity. So we were looking at the recharge capacity, the headwaters through first and second order streams, preferencing areas with those headwaters, the soils in terms of their ability to filter and clean the water, calcareous soils versus sands down in the southern part of this area are very, very different than, your rockier areas in the north. In terms of their ability to filter the water. We looked at the percent of the stream buffers that were forested, and then we looked at overall land cover in the area. And really this was not a terribly complex analysis, and definitely something that could be replicated. So that gave us this final index. Again, you're seeing the priority areas outlined in green, and then the darker blue areas representing the areas with higher ability to produce clean, abundant water. And we assumed again that the risk component, the idea that these areas were at some risk was baked into these green areas from the start. So we didn't add that in. And in retrospect, maybe we would put more emphasis on that. So that was just an interesting piece to note throughout this is, how much, where and when do we include that risk component? So then we gave that to the groups on the ground, provided some technical assistance and support to implement that work. And so this is the original plan from, I'm just going to put on a laser point so you can see where I'm going. This was the original plan from the Upper Lehigh cluster, as we call it, the cluster of watersheds in the Upper Lehigh watershed. And they, again, had identified these parcels. These parcels had been priorities for them for decades. How much were they incorporating water as they thought about that? I think to a large extent, water was always a priority for those partners. And yet, it didn't have that sort of watershed context. So we had a number of meetings, the groups thought about their priorities and how this ability to produce clean, abundant water data set and other metrics might filter in and inform their initial priorities. And they developed a revised analysis that looks at, that is watershed based. So, sort of thinks about, okay, how well do our parcels aggregate within these watersheds? Are there some parcels that drop out in importance when we think like a watershed? We think about where the water is flowing that we're protecting, or off the land that we are protecting. So that was really an amazing initial step, is just, having these groups work together, think like watersheds, and develop priorities. So then what the Open Space Institute grant fund, which by the way it's a $20 million grant fund in total. We've spent over half of that to protect 35,000 acres in 68 projects. But what we were able to do is really tailor our grant fund so that it supported these local groups in achieving the goals they set out in their plans. And so we really, instead of embedding the science into our grant fund, they embedded it into their plans, and then we evaluated how well the projects advanced their goals. You can see the average parcel size of the projects, the range in size, and the land cover. So largely natural cover, either forest, wetland, some bit of agriculture. We did have a very specific forest buffer component where we would pay for the forest buffers on agricultural lands at the cost of the agricultural land. So that also was a component of this. And there are some areas of development across these projects. But what you're seeing is the darker areas are places where the greater than 10% of the watershed was protected through the program. And the main way, so that was how we sort of prioritized and evaluated projects, but then how do we evaluate our impact? So the main way we had to do that was through some of the components that were drivers of the prioritization. So, what's the percent of stream buffer, or what we call active river area, that is protected? What's the percent of headwaters, first and second order watersheds? stream watersheds, what's the amount of wetlands and natural cover. And so we can measure these things, but did we know that we were actually protecting clean water through those results? And that was what led us to conduct a bit of a more in-depth study. And that this started in 2018 and is just wrapped up this year. Ellie, I was going to ask if you could post in the chat that link I gave you to the Delaware Initiative. There's a wonderful website on the initiative. If you want to learn more about it, you can look at that. And then the second link that I wanted to offer everybody is a link to the summary of the two pieces of work I'm going to talk about initially. So when we started out to, on this question of how do we evaluate actually the water quality benefits of our land protection work, the first thing we wanted to do was assess current best practices. So what are conservation programs across the eastern US where we're not dealing with the drought issues in the arid West? What are conservation programs for water quality doing in terms of targeting their land protection and then evaluating their land protection? So we had a wonderful fellow, Josh Morse, work with us to conduct this review of 6 water quality protection programs. One of them, the Beaver Water District, which is represented today, which is really nice to have that link. We selected these groups because of their relevance to the Delaware, and we conducted interviews and then document review to kind of assess these questions of, what are best practices on, again, evaluate project prioritization and then evaluation. And I'm putting this up here, it's too much to read, of course, while we're sitting here together, but just to give you a sense of what the document that you'll get through the link that Ellie shared provides, this is the programs, and we looked at, how they compare by water cover, protection to date, what's their targets, how did they prioritize, and then how did they evaluate the projects. And there's summaries of all these interviews. It's extremely well done by Josh, and I think really interesting for groups thinking about these questions. But what we found was that overall, the data-driven priorities were quite different. But what you'll see is that 3 of the projects, or about 50%, were using some kind of modeled conversion risk to actually drive their project prioritization. So they were looking at that development component, that risk of losing the forest cover, as a driver of where they wanted to invest. And then in terms of evaluation, about half of them were just using kind of acres, and some of them used priority acres if they had some prioritization done. And then others of them were, were diving in and really doing the monitoring that, 3 of them were actually conducting some kind of monitoring to measure that impact. So a couple of observations across this review were that, the prioritization was a bit more science-driven than evaluation for most groups. That was a little easier to handle. Monitoring is certainly a significant cost and complexity to invest in. The approaches to prioritization did favor that avoided development piece, which is hard to predict. But gives us a solid kind of pollutant load number. There was a limited tolerance for science. A lot of the groups felt limited by the practitioner audience and what they could absorb and take in, if their focus was really transactional. So that was part of what limited the use of science to drive prioritization. And that the practical criteria were so critical to these groups, having a project available and dealing with the opportunity was also such a driver of the outcome that, the science didn't drive things as much as the opportunity. And what we found overall, though, that was maybe one of the highlights for me is that really there was very little knowledge of peer approaches and few best practices across the field. So that's, again, something, you'll hear me emphasize a couple times. But the other piece that we did is a really rapid literature review. So this is not a full literature review, but again, Josh Morse conducted this with us and looked at a very thorough review of literature to see the ranges of forest cover needed to maintain clean water. So the question was what's the status of our knowledge on this? We know that there's people out there measuring this, and you know, where does the literature come out at this point? And so what was cool was Josh categorized this stuff by ecological indicators versus chemical and ecological, et cetera. And then the squares being review articles. So this is a fun graph to study, but what you see is if you want those ecological outcomes, you need to be at about 80% forest cover, a little bit higher than just the chemical outcomes. And then for agriculture, you know, you can have a fair bit of agriculture if it's depending on the intensity of the agriculture in a watershed and still maintain clean water. But again, you know, for some the ecological outcome here, you know, limiting it to about 30%. And then development and of course impervious surface being one of the biggest drivers, where you have that little, you know, still that really narrow band for impervious surface before you start to document some kind of ecological and chemical impacts. Okay, so that was the review we did to kind of set us up for a little more creative work, thinking about how we might do this work ourselves. So we had the great fortune of a significant grant from the William Penn Foundation to do this work, and a number of excellent partners to work with. So Stroud Water Research Center, the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel, as well as Center for Land Use and Sustainability at Shippensburg University, were all involved in this. So not a small project. And I do hope that other people could take some of the pieces that we did and implement them in a much more direct and sort of refined way. We tried a lot of things and sort of distilled it down to some of the best, and that's what I'm going to tell you about. But I do recognize that the full extent of what we did is probably unusual to luxury to have. So I'm going to talk about three modeling approaches that we found offered really interesting sort of ways to communicate the benefit of land protection for water quality. And this was conducted on 55 projects that had closed at the time of this analysis. So this is, you know, again, all the way back 3 years. So it's about 20,000 of the 35,000 acres that have been approved for protection through our program, and about 130 miles of stream on those projects. So we conducted three approaches. I'm going to walk through those, or I'm going to walk through these three. We did more. The riparian buffer benefit analysis, which is kind of illustrated by this yellow area along the stream, but then looking at avoided land use change, and then looking at how we can measure the downstream benefit of that avoided land use change. So I'll walk you through those, and I'm just looking at my time, and Ellie and Steve, just jump in and interrupt me but I think if I have 5 more minutes, I can do it.
Yeah, 5 more minutes would be great. Thank you.
Okay, great. And so the first assessment here, modeling riparian buffer benefit, we were looking at not just the project area that was protected, which is here in white, but what's the land area flowing into the stream where the riparian buffer is protected? And what we found was that there's a significant area outside the project areas that are flowing in and being filtered by the forest land on the project. So we wanted to quantify that. So you can see here the project is about 400 acres, and then another 200 plus acres flowing into that area from outside the parcel. So in total, for the 20,000 acres, there was 11,600 acres filtering into those areas. And so that alone, that number, recognizing that the land protection really had a benefit to areas 50% more area outside the areas was alone a very good way to communicate about the impact of land protection. We did assess the pollutant loads filtered using different removal efficiencies for sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And we calculated those as well. And you can, if you really look here, there's some development there. So assuming that some of that pollutant load from that development is filtered by that buffer. And, so that's another approach that we can use to say, this land is providing this kind of service to the surrounding landscape. And of course, that could increase over time as development increases around the project areas. We assess this across all of the projects, with the darker blue dots here being areas with higher levels of pollutant load. And I think my conclusion overall is really that the contributing area itself is almost a more meaningful metric than the pollutant loads that were filtered, but the darker areas do show those areas where there were higher pollutant loads. And whether we want to do projects intentionally where there's more pollutant loads filtering into them is an interesting, but I don't think very promising approach. So the second approach I wanted to talk about is this avoided land use change approach, where we actually developed a number of different approaches to assessing land use change. And the one we settled on, interestingly, we actually had a model, a model for the Delaware that predicted change. But what we found was that model didn't account for the fact that with the knowledge on zoning and actual development opportunities to these specific parcels that were getting protected, and that the land conservation groups that were doing these projects did have that information. So we actually utilized information from our grant applications to assess kind of the best professional guess on likely development for the parcel. So it was a parcel specific analysis, and that's represented here in this last picture, where we were actually drawing the areas that were likely to convert from forest cover to another land use, and then modeling that value. And all this modeling is actually happening on this Model My Watershed website developed by Stroud and a number of other leaders, and it's available for use by any organization. So that's, again, Model My Watershed. It's another link I should have offered to put that in later. And then we even aggregated the parcels that were in a similar watershed. So each of these yellow and green area shapes are parcels that were protected, and aggregated them together in watersheds. And we're able to kind of summarize the avoided modification of the land, the avoided acres of impervious surface, the avoided capital and stormwater maintenance costs, and also the impact relative, the avoided impact relative to the total pollutant loads in these watersheds. And that's where you see the greatest benefit from working in headwaters and from aggregating projects. So you can see here, these are the pollutant load results from that approach. And then this last piece looked at the downstream benefit of that. So looked at how far downstream the avoided pollutant load would be detected down to 5% of the concentration, pollutant load concentration in the streams. So this was an interesting thought experiment where we're expanding the watershed and we're calculating the in-stream pollutant load relative to what would be avoided until we stop when the pollutant load is less than 5% of the total pollutant load in that stream. So that's a really interesting approach, and gives you an actual length. And in total, the length of those streams was really significant across the basin. And it also helps you understand the area, the very large area in some cases that were benefited by the land protection. So, these were some of the factors that drove the downstream length, certainly the size of the project, the development surrounding the project. And this really, the longer stream tails, we're really in places of intact headwaters. So it sort of gives a new kind of approach to saying, to driving protection and evaluating the value of protection in those intact headwaters where you may not see as much development risk. So just putting all of these pieces together, some observations that one thing I want to be absolutely clear about is that the pollutant loads avoided and filtered were minimal compared to farm restoration kinds of impacts. So, you know, keeping that in mind, that those pollutant loads aren't going to necessarily wow, you know, your utilities or, you know, regulators. The conceptual framework, in a way, you know, the ability to kind of communicate the value may be more valuable than the pollutant load values themselves. The total acres protected actually drove the results. So larger projects drove the results more than development pressure. So again, that led us to think really targeting land in more intact locations where you have larger projects may still be the way to go over putting it in places with the greatest development pressure.
Oh, 2 more minutes. Sorry, Abby.
Yeah, well, so
No
I'll
problem,
just,
no problem.
no, I'll just put those up. We can share these slides. It is a lot. It's a lot to digest. It's been a lot for us to digest, and we'd love to just, I think, discuss it if we have some time. But these were the questions that I wanted to pose for all of us for discussion. And I just apologize for not being better with time management. There was a lot here to present.
No problem at all.
Apologies if it came too quick, but over to you, Ellie.
No, thank you. Yeah, excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I wish we had more time to, yeah, just give everyone an hour to present. This is just fascinating. Yes, if you want to save those discussion questions, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end. I know we have a couple questions in the chat. At this point, I'm going to move to Alec King, our next presenter. And again, we'll do a group question and answer session at the end of our presentations. So thank you again for that excellent presentation. And Alec, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Well, so I'm Alec King, and I'm the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program Coordinator. And my position is, it's the first of its kind in Texas. So I'm actually employed by the Texas Land Trust Council, but I'm housed in the NRCS state office. So the purpose of my position is to assist NRCS with administrating the agricultural land easements under ACEP, and help the land trusts apply and navigate the certain requirements and processes for closing an easement through NRCS. So just to give kind of an overview of what a conservation easement is, so landowners own various rights to their property. These could be water rights, mineral rights, management rights, etc. And one of these rights is the right to build a house or a shopping mall. So landowners can voluntarily sell or donate their development rights to a third party that then holds those easements and enforces the deed restrictions. So once a conservation easement is placed on the deed to a property and filed in a local courthouse, those restrictions stay with the property forever. So it's really important to have a good relationship with the land trust that you'd be selling that easement to, or the agency that you'd be selling that easement to. So if the property is ever sold or transferred to heirs, the subsequent landowner is going to be held to the terms that are in that deed, and they must abide by the restrictions set out in the conservation easement. So under ACEP, there's two main components. There's the agricultural land easements, which the purpose is to protect agricultural, grazing, and related conservation values by limiting impervious surface. Those non-compatible uses would be any kind of development. And in Texas, wildlife management is considered an agricultural activity. So an agricultural land easement does not necessarily need to be in production to qualify for an ag land easement. And then we've got the wetland reserve easements, which the purpose of that is to restore, protect, and enhance degraded wetlands. So there is a degraded wetland component to entering into a wetland reserve easement. So the biggest difference between these two components of the ACEP program is agricultural land easements are held by partnering entities. So that would be a land trust, sometimes local governments, nonprofit groups. So these entities are in charge of, when they purchase the easement, they're in charge of monitoring these easements to make sure that the landowners continuing to abide by the rules set out in the deed. And then they're in charge of enforcement. So if they find any violations, they'll have to work with the landowner to resolve it, or litigate to remediate any kind of damage that could be done to the conservation values on the property. And wetland reserve easements are actually purchased and held by NRCS on behalf of the United States. So the landowner will work with NRCS on anything related to their easement, and NRCS will actually go out there and monitor and enforce easement terms. So violations with these are usually they usually have to come usually a typical violation is something like moving water from on property to off property, or in one case we had a hunting blind that was outside a building envelope, and they decided that this hunting blind needed a stove and a couple bunk beds, which is definitely a violation of the easement terms. So on here we can see the typical easement terms. So under ACEP, we've got ag land easements, which is ALE, and then we've got a designation of agricultural land easements, which is grassland of special significance. So these programs increase in the restrictions that they're going to put on the deed. So an ag land easement is minimally restrictive. There's a 2% impervious surface limitation within designated building envelopes. So a landowner doesn't necessarily know where they want to put their next barn or their next house, so they can designate certain areas on the easement that they can build a house for their kid, and it limits the number of subdivisions, so limits fragmentation of the property, limits on mineral extraction. In Texas, it's an oil and gas state, so there's quite a bit of mineral extraction, so you won't have oil companies coming in and destroying the conservation values by putting in extraction pads. And then water rights must remain with the land. So you can use water from your property on your property, but you can't pump water off your property. Under a grassland of special significance, this is designated by less than 5% invasive species. And with that, NRCS will actually provide 75% of the easement value. It's got the same limitations as an agricultural land easement, but with a grassland of special significance, the land must remain in grassland. So it can't be moved from pasture to a more intensive type of agriculture like row cropping. And with that, it has to have a grazing management plan on file that the landowner has to abide by, so that those grassland values remain intact. And then a wetland reserve easement is by far the most highly restrictive. You're prohibited from grazing, planting, harvesting crops. That land is essentially, you're selling all of your management rights. You cannot do anything to the surface of that property. Otherwise, you need a compatible use authorization. So if you're a landowner and you want to graze your wetland easement, that'll require a compatible use authorization, which would need to be approved by NRCS in order to do that. So if it's something that benefits the conservation values, it can be approved. But if you just want a food plot, to hunt some deer, that's not going to benefit the wetland values. So most likely that would be something that gets denied. And with the restrictions that you're putting on the deed, that's going to change the value of your conservation easement. So these NRCS programs with ACEP-ALE, NRCS will provide 50% of the easement value. So here you can see on our graph, this is just real easy numbers. So it's visually easy to understand. So so we're saying that this property appraised at $3 million before the easement was put on the property. So with ACEP-ALE, that the landowner is selling their development rights, and the appraiser is going to say those development rights are worth about $1 million. So NRCS through ALE will provide 500,000 of that $1 million, and then the partnering entity, so the land trust or local government, would need to come up with the other 50%. And we have quite a few municipal bond programs in Texas that provide some of that funding, and we have a state program, the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Program, provides some of that matching funds. And a lot of times we actually get landowners that donate that other 50%. And then you can see with a grassland of special significance, you're selling some of your management rights, not all of them. So that's going to be another $500,000, and NRCS will provide up to 75% for a grassland easement. And then wetland reserve, since you're selling your development rights and all of your management rights, NRCS will provide up to 80% of the easement value on those. And then you can see in blue, that's the remaining market value after the conservation easement. So for the landowner, that does have an impact on their property taxes. So in Texas, we get about $5 million allocated each year for agricultural land easements. And we have, every year we have about 35 applications requesting about $40 to $45 million in funds. So obviously we're gonna have to pick some projects, and some are gonna have to be, we need a criteria in order to select those projects. So our ranking criteria is based on farmland to be protected and the threat of development. So that's going to be population growth, population density, and decrease in average farm size in the county. Other factors for consideration, maximizing contiguous acres. So if there are other easements adjacent, that's going to give it a boost in the ranking point, because we want to get as much land as possible contiguously. And then benefit to water quality. So that's where the watershed protection plans come in. In 2021, we brought the land trusts together to adjust the ranking criteria and point allocations for ACEP-ALE. And one of the changes that we made was to include watershed protection plans and aquifer recharge to our list of ranking criteria. So this has actually led to a shift in the projects that we've selected toward watersheds that need buffers and water infiltration. And then last, we've got the benefit to wildlife and threatened and endangered species. So if there's endangered species habitat or documented occurrence of endangered species on the property, that's also going to give it a big boost in ranking points. And then, so how we select projects based off our ranking criteria. So typically we're allocated about $5 million a year, and we can spend that money until it's all gone. So you can see in our example here, the first two projects take up about $3.5 million. So that leaves us with $1.5 million left. We can't pick up the third project, so we can skip down to project 4 and so on until we pick up, until we spend all of our money. So this is one project that we closed just a couple years ago. The Dahlstrom Ranch is it's just over 2,200 acres in conservation easement in Hays County, which is just about 15 miles south of Austin, Texas. And this property was selected based on the extensive karst features found throughout the property. And as you can see here, this is the ranch manager that's spent quite a bit of time exploring these little caves. And it's very cool. There's these fissures in the ground, and some of them open up into room-sized caves. I mean, 15 feet around, and you can stand up inside of them. Very, very cool. So these karst features recharge the Edwards Aquifer, which is the primary source of drinking water for the city of Austin, the city of San Antonio, and all of the municipalities along the I-35 corridor. And this property in particular, they did a dye tracing study, and the water that infiltrates these caves actually ends up in Barton Springs, which you can see on the bottom right there. That's one of the most popular swimming holes in the city of Austin. It's beautiful, crystal clear water, 74 degrees all year long. And this 2,200 acre ranch directly recharges, and the water that lands, you know, the rainwater that lands on this ranch ends up coming out right there in Barton Springs. So very cool. This preserve also has 328 acres that are set aside specifically for public access. So the investment made in this easement not only directly benefits the people of the city of Austin, but it also provides educational opportunities to the community to understand the importance of conservation and the benefits that we all receive from protecting land. So in Texas, for ACEP, there's $500 million allocated nationwide. This is expected to go up with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. In the next fiscal year 23, there should be another 100 million. In 2024, there will be another 200 million. So funding for the ACEP program is going to go up the next few years. In 2022, we were allocated 13.5 million, which allowed us to pick up 7 projects totaling 5,377 acres. And we also closed on 3,720 acres in 2022. So on the right-hand side, you can see all the easements that we have in Texas. We've got 1,753,000 acres conserved in Texas. And as you can see, between Austin and San Antonio is kind of a hotbed for these conservation easements. And that's because of the water recharge. That aquifer is really important for the people of those cities. And then you can also see most of these easements are sticking along these riparian zones down to the coast. And that's all I've got. So if you want to know more about Texas Land Trust Council, you can go to our website, texaslandtrustcouncil.org. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Ellie.
Great. Thank you very much, Alec. Really, really excellent presentation. We are going to move to our third presenter now. And I think I mistakenly said that it was going to be Grady and then Becky, but it's actually the reverse. So I'm going to pass it on to Becky right now.
All right, thank you. Okay, so yeah, I'm Becky Roark, Executive Director with the Beaver Watershed Alliance. And we're just happy to be here to talk about how we're working together in the Beaver Lake Watershed for source water protection. And part of that is land conservation. So happy to kind of share how that all works together for us. So just to kind of paint a picture of Northwest Arkansas, we have Beaver Lake, you see up here on the left, and it's our drinking water source for over 500,000 people here. It's also hydroelectric power and generates a lot of tourism dollars for the state. We also have a really robust ag community, several Fortune 500 companies here in the corner of the state, and some really beautiful landscapes working to protect and restore, like prairies and riparian areas along 2,800 miles of creeks and streams, forested areas. And we have a lot of threatened and endangered species too that we're working to protect habitat for. So the Beaver Lake watershed is actually in the headwaters of the White River system. So you can see that on the left here. And the White River system starts here in Northwest Arkansas and then is dammed up at Beaver Lake. And there's 2 other dams, and then it free flows all the way down over to the Mississippi. So the Alliance really focuses on the lands and waters that drain into Beaver Lake because that is our drinking water supply. So several tributaries, you see here, Middle Fork, West Fork, East Fork, War Eagle Creek, which feeds 1/3 of the lake's water system. So the Beaver Lake watershed itself is a priority area defined by the Arkansas Department of Natural Resources. And several creeks and streams up here are on the 303D list and have been for a while. So I'll talk a little bit more about one in particular later, but We keep an eye on this list, it comes out every 2 years, as you all know. So we're just looking at what those impairments are and the relationships between the impairments and land use and all those various components. This corner of the state is also a nutrient surplus area. So that's managed by the Arkansas Department of Ag, Natural Resources Division. So anything that's being applied in terms of nutrients or poultry litter has to have a nutrient management plan if they have 2.5 acres or more. So, and these plans are also reviewed every 5 years and updated. So I just wanted to throw in that we do have this nutrient surplus management as part of our area and watershed. So our land use here is mostly forested, about 70%, with 21% pasture. And because of all of our steep slopes and things, we have a lot of flashy streams that rise and fall here. And when it rains, we have springs that come out of the ground. We're a little bit opposite of a lot of watersheds that our water comes from the ground and not from the top of a mountain. And we have a karst geology, so a lot of cave systems and underground water supplies that we're looking to also protect. And kind of juxtaposition to that is a rapidly growing urban area and a corridor here in Northwest Arkansas. So some of our issues and challenges here are that we do get 50 to 60 inches of rain per year. And as mentioned, our streams are really flashy and they have highly erodible soils in the floodplain area. So those are really critical parts of the watershed to look to protect. And this equates to about 4 to 5 truckloads of sediment that are moved every day from Beaver Water District, so water utility on the lake. So knowing all of these things, a group came together in 2009, the Northwest Arkansas Council, and they initiated the Beaver Lake Watershed Protection Strategy. And in 2011, the Alliance was formed through a stakeholder-led process, and we had the first 9-element plan in Arkansas. And then fast forward to today, and that strategy is undergoing an update. So you see here on the left, the bottom left, we're really trying to prepare for 1 million people by 2045. We have about 30 people moving here per day. So all of this projected growth makes sediment loading reductions essential to maintaining source water quality, but land conservation is a big part of this. So you can see the growth on this urban corridor on the western side of the watershed here. So, and then the rest of this is mostly forested land. And the chart on the right here shows where that sediment is being contributed or where that's coming from. So mostly channel erosion. However, the projections show that channel erosion is going to continue to be the leading contributor of sediment, but it's also closely followed by low density development. So land conservation is in our strategy, and it is the #1 thing we can do to reduce this sediment for our watershed by protecting pasture lands and farmlands and protecting forested lands. That's a big part of protecting the water quality of Beaver Lake. And we do have tools we use. So on the left, you see a Beaver Lake Watershed Conservation Priority Index that was developed by the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust. Grady will be sharing after me. And on the right-hand side, we just adopted that and overlaid parcel data on that so that we can better see where the opportunities are for land conservation. So although we don't do land conservation directly, we do work with groups and landowners to achieve land conservation goals because it's part of our strategy. So we do have about 65,000 acres of parcels, or I'm sorry, 65,000 parcels in this watershed. So our biggest opportunity for source water protection is really directly engaging with the landowners. So like you see here, we take them out and show them stream bank restoration, or we'll take them out and show them prescribed burns or pasture aeration or some of those practices so they can take those back to their lands and apply them. And when we started out, we were only reaching about 400 landowners a year. That's grown to over 37,000 landowners reached annually. And we're also tracking our BMPs and site visits to kind of better understand what do landowners want to do and apply on their land, what's being done in each sub watershed, those impacts. So we have a couple of landscape scale projects in the priority subbasins. One of those was the West Fork White River Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, and that was $8.4 million, and that included land conservation. So you can see the partners at the top of the slide here. Those are the core partners that have really helped bring these RCPP dollars into the watershed area and achieve conservation results. And we were just awarded a $5 million for a RCPP for the War Eagle watershed. So how do we measure our impacts? Well, we just developed this watershed success metrics framework. And this is really a way to guide how we quantify our watershed success. And this was inspired by EPA social indicators metrics. So there's drivers and indicators for social mitigation and ecological outcomes. So we'll have this framework up on our website probably within the next week or so, but it was a year-long project working with several stakeholders and looking at what are the important things that make watershed success. And speaking of, the ultimate metric we have is the delisting of stream segments off of that 303 delist. So recently we had 16.5 miles removed from the state's list of impaired waters for turbidity. So we like to share this anytime we can because it's a big success. And that's mostly due to decades of accomplishments. So the West Fork White River has been on that 303D list since 1998. So this has been several decades of partners working together, state agencies and things that helped to make this happen. And land conservation was a part of it. So just a note on funding. So we work a lot with our state agencies for 319 funding, and we leverage those with local sponsorships. So this, to date, there's probably more here to add, but we had over 17 319 projects here in the watershed. We leveraged $3.6 million to equal $7.8 million in total investments in this reservoir. And we're also recipients of Beaver Water District. It's a utility on the lake for source water protection funding. So this is 4 cents for every 1,000 gallons sold, goes into a source water protection fund. And that helps to fund us, the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust, and a couple other conservation organizations. We've also been able to take that funding and leverage it up to $9.7 million for additional programming and project implementation. So I just wanted to wrap up with Steve mentioned the Healthy Watershed Consortium program, and we did a project with them back in 2018 just to really look at funding mechanisms for advancing of the Beaver Lake Watershed Protection Strategy. And a lot of these things we do cost a lot of money. Land conservation and land prices are just going through the roof right now in Northwest Arkansas. There's a lot of things that we just need to raise a lot of dollars for. So this grant helped to kind of just do an analysis and look at what funding opportunities there are for this area. And one of those was looking at the clean water and drinking water SRF. Another one was looking at the water utilities on Beaver Lake, the other utilities, and looking at just in general, the revenue shed. So just a note on the clean water and drinking water SRF, we do have that program in place here at the state, and we do have a natural infrastructure element that's in the SRF, and that can lower the interest rate down to 0.5% for projects. So, this is in place, but as far as I'm aware of, I don't think any projects have been done in Northwest Arkansas utilizing the SRF for natural infrastructure. And then the biggest challenge for the funding on the SRF side is how are we going to pay it back? So you have to have a repayment stream for the loan. So we looked at sponsorship financing, special assessments, and maybe revenues or stormwater utility fees. So although none of these have been realized in Northwest Arkansas, at least now we know kind of some different paths we could take to do this. And in terms of just building consensus with the other water utilities, Beaver Water District serves 80% of the region's water users, and the other three combined only have 20% of the water users. So at this time, a source water protection rate wasn't of interest to the other three suppliers, but as we grow and develop, that may change. If the other three did decide to do the source water protection fund, they could raise an additional $445,000 annually, which some of that could go towards land conservation. And then just in terms of looking at the revenue shed, what are those different opportunities we have? We looked at watershed protection fees, revenue bonds, green bonds, the SRFs, stormwater utility fees, hydroelectric, because we do have hydroelectric on the lake, taxing for flood control, which are also called improvement districts. And then we also had a revenue shed tool developed. So say you're wanting to raise a certain amount of money for land conservation or another project, you can just look at kind of plug and play into this. What if you were to, and this is for like water utilities and wastewater utilities to use. You know, what if you change the rates on those bills? If we had a stormwater fee, what would that look like? Or that hydroelectric power. So we do have a tool in place to help decision makers. And then, of course, we work with a lot of great partners for this. It takes a lot of people working together for source water protection. So we would just appreciate everybody that provides financial support, but also in-kind support through expertise or engaging in program development, volunteering, those kinds of things. So we just really appreciate all the partners we have the opportunity to work with here in the Beaver Lake watershed area. And that's all that I have for today. I just really appreciate this opportunity. And, you know, we work really closely with the land trust and excited for Grady's presentation too, but we have a really neat conservation corps here in Northwest Arkansas. So we all work really closely together and know each other well. And so it's just really neat to have this opportunity to share our story today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. Really, really excellent presentation and fantastic work. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. At this point, we'll move to our final presentation from Grady Spann. So Grady, go ahead and share your screen. I just want to acknowledge really great comments in the chat. Thank you all for your engagement. And we do have some questions too. And we're running a little short on time, but we will hopefully have a few minutes at the end to get to at least a couple of these questions. So thank you all for your time. Yeah, looks good, Grady. Oh, I think you might still be muted.
Okay,
Yeah, sounds good now.
now we're on. Okay, thank you. I am Grady Spann. I'm the Executive Director of the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust, and thank you for having us today. And I want to tell you what I guess we do on the ground. Everybody else has been talking about kind of a larger view. I'm the guy who actually takes all these ideas maybe and applies them. We are a 501c3 conservation organization. We're not a government organization. And so we really depend on donations, philanthropies, and just grants to operate and do what we do. We were founded in 2003, so about 20 years ago. We started this with just kind of real grassroots effort to create an organization to start protecting land and saving land. And we are the local land trust for Northwest Arkansas. We're accredited through the Land Trust Accreditation Commission, which is pretty important. Our mission is pretty simple. We want to preserve and enhance the quality of life of all people in Northwest Arkansas through the permanent protection of land. And we really want to emphasize the word all, because there's so many different people coming to Northwest Arkansas. It's a very diverse population, and we're excited about so many people moving in. As Becky said, about 30 people a day move into Northwest Arkansas to start their lives and build a home there. We focus primarily on 13 counties in Northwest Arkansas, but our core service area are the 4 counties in Northwest Arkansas: Benton, Washington, Madison, and Carroll County, because those are the counties that are really experiencing the greatest growth right now through this time in Northwest Arkansas. So we do things kind of, we protect different things and places we protect. And I'm just going to show you images as we go through this. One is scenic landscapes. And if you ever drive up through Northwest Arkansas, you'll understand that this is what you see. It's a very, well, we don't have mountains here, but we have really deep valleys. And so this is the kind of image that you see. But we also protect family farms and working lands. So one of our mission is to protect the local food source. So we want to protect those local farm operations for vegetable and food, fruit economy. We also want to protect healthy forests, wetlands, rivers, and streams that we've been talking about, because quality of water is so important as we grow and try to protect and save land in harmony with development that is going on. We also protect historic and cultural sites. It's amazing that people do donate land to us, and sometimes it comes with a church from 1888, an old Methodist church that was built in 1888. We got a donation a few months back that included a 1910 farmhouse. So we are also committed to protecting historic and cultural sites as we protect land. And then the last thing that we do, which is very important, especially for quality of life, is the protection of outdoor recreation and the importance of giving the ability to experience nature and to be in nature, because as we learned through COVID, nature is really a safe place to be. It's a healing place to be. And so we want to make sure that as we protect land, especially the lands that we own, that access to that land is available to the residents of the area. And then how we protect land is through land donations. Like I mentioned earlier, we've had a few instances where we get a call from a lawyer and say, you are now the proud owner of a farm. And we didn't expect that. And so we impacted somebody's life in the past to where they donated their land to us upon their passing. And so we get to manage and protect that land. We also do conservation easements. And I think Alec did a great job in explaining what a conservation easement is. And that's the majority of the work we do, is with local landowners to protect their lands that they feel so passionate about. And the neat thing about conservation easements to me is that the fact that we can tailor those easements to meet the desires and the wishes of the landowner. And then, of course, as Alec said, that conservation easement stays with that piece of property forever. And then we also do purchase land. We've done this a few times, and it's just where a piece of land is so critical that we feel that we must purchase it. And so we raise the funds and actually go out and purchase land to protect that land. And then also we have partnerships. We do work with the local philanthropic organizations in Northwest Arkansas. The Walton Family Foundation is one that is very important to us, but also other partners like the Beaver Water District works with us hand in hand to protect properties and put conservation easements on properties that directly impact the watershed into Beaver Lake. Land stewards, you know, we also, as we protect lands, then we have the responsibility to create a land management plan, to do habitat restoration when possible and when we have the funding to do that. We also, like I said, we have accessibility to some of our lands. So trail construction and maintenance becomes a critical part, and we depend on a lot of people to do that. We do water quality monitoring and working with the local university to do that. And we also, as people put their land into conservation easements, we go and monitor their land at least once a year to maintain our accreditation with the Land Trust Association. So we work very closely with landowners to make sure they are following the easement, the conservation easement that goes along with that property. And then we also put money back with every single property that we protect. We put a certain amount of dollars back to be ready to defend and protect those lands through court. And so we have just a fund that's used for legal defense. And then another thing that we do is we do try to purchase land or protect land that's creates a corridor. And this is an example of a corridor that we're trying to protect that is not only a corridor for wildlife movement and wildlife management, but also for recreation, where things are connecting to each other through a quickly developing area to where we have a larger spot, and not just green islands everywhere, but a major protected area. And this is an example of one. These are examples of just quick overview of examples of properties that we currently protect. Some of these are privately owned properties with conservation easements, so there is no public access. And then other ones like Flint Creek Headwaters Preserve, we actually own the property, or Kessler Mountain Preserve, that are allowed to have public access, and people really enjoy those areas. Becky talked about the growth in the area. And so on the left, you see there's 2011, kind of a snapshot of the red, which is the developing area. And then on the right, you can see how much that area is going to grow by the year 2050. We expect to have about 500,000 new residents move into Northwest Arkansas, primarily in Benton and Washington County and Carroll and Madison counties. So those 4 counties are going to be greatly impacted. So we have to work with developers today to ensure that we protect these green spaces and our water quality for the future. And that's one of our priorities, is to protect and conserve clean water. We also want to protect, and one of the benefits is wildlife habitat. We're really focused on wildlife habitat because all that impacts the quality of life for everybody else. And the other thing, another benefit, like I mentioned earlier, is local food and farms. We really want to become a more sustainable area in the nation, to where we can sustain ourselves with locally grown and locally sourced foods. And then another great benefit is access to nature. Part of the neat thing about our land trust is we actually have a classroom that we bring in over 2,000 students in a year to teach them and to engage them with the importance of conservation, and to understand the importance of protecting and saving land, nature, water quality, air quality, and so forth. This is a good quote, and I don't know if I can move my screen out of the way, but anyways, this is a great quote by Mr. Nelson, where basically he says that it's really cool if somebody puts their land in protection with the understanding that they'll never hear the thanks from generations in the future. And that's such a great gift. We call it a land legacy gift, that somebody would put their land in conservation, knowing that generations from now, people will not see or be able to thank him in person. And we also depend on a lot of volunteers to do different things. And this is a big part of land trust, I think, across the nation, is that volunteers are special to us because they allow us to do so many great things. And you can also join a land trust to help support it, and or you can make a great gift if you so desire. And those are just the ways that we are able to operate, because we have to raise our funds to operate and to continue to protect land and manage the land that we already have in conservation easements. And that's who I am and who we are as a land trust.
Great. Thank you so much, Grady. Really excellent presentation to end on. I appreciate the message and all the holistic benefits of land conservation. It was really, really good ending note. Now we'll get to move towards our question portion. It looks like Abby and Becky have been answering some questions in the chat. So really, really appreciate you both doing that so we can get as many questions answered as possible. It looks like we have a few more questions. So I'll start with those that have come in the chat that haven't been answered yet. We do have one for Grady. This person asked, are you able to use aerial images for compliance checks? And then a comment, good to see you are looking at working lands with the concept of protecting water quality instead of just preservation.
Okay, so to answer your first part of your question is, we can use aerial images for compliance. You know, technology really allows you to do that. But in fact, I had this conversation today with my director of land stewardship. You know, the important part of what we do is to create a trusting relationship with landowners. And part of that trusting relationship is going to that land and looking at it physically and then spending time with that landowner to see if he has any questions or he or she have any questions, if they have any concerns. And so we don't use aerial images for the simple reason that we want to maintain and continue to maintain a personal relationship with each landowner. Yeah, that takes a lot more time and it's a lot more effort, but it's so important to create that relationship, because as that land passes to the next owner or their heirs, they already know that we have continued a relationship throughout years. And so in a pinch, I guess we could do that, but we would rather not, just because of that connection with the land and the landowner.
Great, thank you very much. One more question for you in the chat, Grady. Paul asked, how do you provide protection for that growth area? Can you purchase and preserve an intact riparian buffer and or limit the amount of degraded land in the red blob, perhaps a 50% natural cover or open space?
Okay, so how do we provide protection? It's simply, again, working very closely with land developers. On average, we lose 9 acres a day to development in Northwest Arkansas, which is a scary statistic. And so what we're doing right now is just working very closely with developers. We have one developer that's actually, as they build, you know, more rooftops, they are preserving land that enables the houses that they're building to have a natural scape around it, a natural landscape around it. And so we're just having to really just reach out very closely and to protect land in the growth area. Another thing is we have people that are simply coming up to us and saying, I want to protect land, find a piece of property, and I'll just use a number, $1 million to spend to protect land. And then you put a conservation easement, and then we'll sell the land, and then we're going to do it again. So it's buy, protect, sell. And so we do that. We're starting to do that more and more. And we have people that have retired to this area or have a great passion for the area that are just simply allowing us to purchase land. And in fact, I got a text just a minute ago from somebody who wants to do that. They want to protect acreage, and then they want us to put a conservation easement, and then it's protected forever, sell it, and then go and buy another piece of property. So it's really working with just people who are wanting to be good stewards of the land in that case. And so the other thing is working with stream banks and riparian zones, buffers. We work with the Beaver Water District. We work with Beaver Watershed Alliance and other ones to protect streams all up and down. There's just several organizations that we're all working together to do this. I just got out of a meeting with the Nature Conservancy, Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission. And so we are all partners trying to do the same thing, and understanding the rapid growth in the area and the critical need to protect lands, and especially water quality, is a mission of all of us working together. And I think limit the amount of degraded land in the red blob. You know, I don't know, that would be up to communities and local legislators and local, you know, government officials to implement something like that. I'm not sure if there's a desire to do that, because we are a state that is it's not publicly owned. Most of our state is privately owned. And that's one of the challenges that we have is Becky mentioned, you know, all the different land plots or, you know, I think it was, how many was that, Becky? 60,000?
65,000 parcels.
65,000 parcels, and that's all private landowners. And so, you know, the challenge there is to just continually get our message out, continue to educate people the importance of protection of land, and that we are here to help you do that. So that's kind of our approach to how we are trying to save land in the area.
Great, thank you very much. One question for all of you, just considering the fact that the audience on today's webcast are largely non-point source state staff members, what are your thoughts on a role that the non-point source program can play in supporting land conservation efforts? And I will credit Steve for this good question. So anyone can please feel free to jump in.
Ellie, can you say the question again?
Yeah, so considering that the audience on today's webcast are largely members of the non-point source program, mostly state staff, what are your thoughts on the role that they could play as members of the non-point source program in supporting land conservation efforts?
I can share a little bit. I guess one of the things I was emphasizing in my presentation is these best practices. And so having some consistent approaches that are valid for conservation groups to use to prioritize and receive funding, you know, for conservation projects. And just like, it may be that the bar isn't too high on that, and that there would be allowance for a lot of different approaches. But I think for a lot of groups, it's knowing what approaches to use or having examples out there and having them be within reach and practical for groups. So that's a guess. Other people on this call maybe even have other ideas, but I think, yeah, so providing that kind of technical assistance or quick guides that don't require a lot of time or reading to kind of figure out how to pull down that funding for the work that they're probably already doing.
Yeah, I would tag on to that and just say, you know, with the easement program here in Texas, we use those watershed protection plans as a criteria to select projects for funding because we want to make sure that the funds that we're expending are being used in coordination with all interested stakeholders and those best management practices. You know, if we're conserving land, we want to make sure that the land that we're conserving is going to be managed appropriately.
Great, thank you so much. We are about at our time today, so I'll go ahead and wrap us up so we don't go too far over. I just want to thank all of our presenters again. Really, really excellent work, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share all of the really excellent things you're doing with us. I think it's a good peek into a very related but sometimes different side of the work that we're doing in the non-point source program. So really, really fantastic way to end this series for the year. So this is the last non-point source technical exchange webcast of 2022. So you'll see us back in the new year. So really looking forward to continue sharing just different kind of technical and engagement type presentations with you all in 2023. Thank you so much for following. And thank you again, especially to Steve, for pulling together this really excellent group of panelists. So thank you all for joining, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you so much.